In 1952, late one night at the Willard Asylum in New York, a nurse walked into a room to find a dead patient, but when she arrived in the room, she was literally shocked. The patient still strapped to the electroshock chair. His eyes were wide open, and then what happened to her was unbelievable. Hi guys, welcome to the Tales of Terror. Today we're going to cover the 10 scariest real-life horror stories that were disturbing as hell and also try to understand their past in the video. So, let's begin. Our journey begins at the Willard Asylum for the chronically insane in New York. Opened in the 19th century, this place was supposed to help people with mental illness. But instead of peace, it became a place of fear. The story of Willard Asylum is full of dark and scary moments. One night in 1952, a nurse walked into a room and saw something she would never forget. A patient was strapped to an electroshock chair, dead. His eyes were wide open, filled with terror. This shocking sight shows the horrors that happen within these walls. The asylum was built in 1869 with support from President Lincoln just days before he was killed. It was meant to be a safe place for those suffering from mental illness. The patients who came here had terrible pasts. Some were locked in tiny crates, while others were chained up since they were children. The asylum was built like a big, fancy house with separate areas for men and women. There was even a bowling alley and ice baths, which seem nice until you hear about the treatments. Treatments like electroshock therapy were common. Patients were often subjected to this painful and frightening procedure. Imagine the fear they must have felt, knowing they could be strapped to that chair at any moment. The asylum was supposed to help, but it often made things worse. By 1995, Willard Asylum closed its doors for good. The last patient left, and the building started to fall apart. Some parts were used for other things, but many were left to crumble. The walls are now silent, but they still hold the whispers of the past. Today, the ruins of Willard Asylum stand as a reminder of those dark times. Walking through its decaying halls, you can almost hear the echoes of the patients' cries. The place feels heavy with sadness and fear. Willard Asylum is a chilling example of how places meant for healing can turn into sites of horror. The stories from this asylum are not just about the past, they are a warning of what happens when care and compassion are replaced by fear and suffering. Next, we travel to Riverview Hospital in British Columbia, Canada. This hospital was once a bustling place for treating mental illness. But now, it's empty and its dark history still lingers. Riverview Hospital opened in the early 1900s. It was built on a huge piece of land, over 247 acres. The hospital's founders believed that nature could help heal the mind. So, they designed the hospital with beautiful gardens and open spaces. But behind the pretty exterior, terrible things were happening. By the 1950s, more than 4,300 patients lived there. Many of them faced awful treatments. Electroshock therapy was common. Patients were strapped to a chair and shocked with electricity. The pain and fear were unimaginable. There were also rumors of illegal sterilizations. Some patients were forced to have surgeries so they could never have children. This was done without their consent. The hospital's dark practices led to settlements for those who suffered in silence. As medical science improved, fewer people needed to stay in hospitals like Riverview. But even as patient numbers went down, the cruel treatments continued. The hospital's dark reputation grew, and stories of ghostly encounters started to spread. People say that Riverview is haunted. Visitors and former staff report strange things. They hear unexplained noises and see ghostly figures in the hallways. One of the most chilling tales is about a shadowy figure seen near the West Lawn Pavilion. This part of the hospital housed the most disturbed male patients until it closed in 1983. The figure is believed to be the ghost of a former patient who died there. Today, Riverview Hospital stands empty. Its grand buildings are decaying, and the once beautiful gardens are overgrown. Walking through its abandoned corridors, you can feel the weight of its troubled past. The silence is eerie, filled with the echoes of the pain and suffering that once filled the air. Riverview Hospital is a place where nature and beauty were meant to heal, but instead, darkness took over. The stories of this hospital remind us of the thin line between care and cruelty. They warn us of the horrors that can happen when vulnerable people are mistreated. Now, let's journey to Costa Rica, where the Santa Ana Sanatorium holds dark and tragic secrets. This place, meant to be a hospital, turned into a site of fear and mystery. The Santa Ana Sanatorium was opened in 1918 by Dr. Carlos Duran. It was originally built to treat people with tuberculosis, a deadly disease at the time. Dr. Duran's own daughter died from tuberculosis shortly after the hospital opened. Her death added a layer of sadness to the place. Over the years, the sanatorium changed. It started taking in not just tuberculosis patients, but also people with mental illnesses and even criminals. The nuns from the Sisters of Charity helped run the place, but the conditions were far from good. Imagine living in a place where the sick and the insane were mixed together. The atmosphere was heavy with suffering and despair. Patients with mental illnesses were often treated poorly. Some were tied to their beds, while others faced harsh treatments that did more harm than good. As time went on, the need for a tuberculosis hospital decreased. New treatments were found, and fewer people needed to stay there. By the 1960s, the sanatorium was mostly empty. The remaining patients with mental illnesses were moved to bigger hospitals. But the story doesn't end there. The Santa Ana Sanatorium became an orphanage and then a prison. These transformations only added to the place's dark history. The final blow came in 1994 when the nearby Eerie volcano erupted. The eruption damaged the already crumbling buildings. Today, the Santa Ana Sanatorium stands abandoned. The buildings are falling apart and nature has started to take over. But the place is not silent. People say it's one of the most haunted places in Costa Rica. They report hearing ghostly whispers and seeing strange shadows. One of the most chilling stories is about a former patient who still roams the halls. People claim to see a figure in old hospital clothes, moving silently through the decaying rooms. The air grows cold, and an eerie feeling surrounds anyone who dares to visit. Walking through the Santa Ana Sanatorium today, you can feel the weight of its tragic past. The walls seem to whisper the stories of those who suffered there. The place is a stark reminder of how easily a place meant for healing can turn into a site of horror. The Santa Ana Sanatorium's dark history warns us about the thin line between care and neglect. It shows us the haunting consequences when places of hope become places of despair. Our next stop is Denbigh Asylum in North Wales. This place was meant to be a sanctuary but became known for its dark and terrifying history. Denbigh Asylum was built between 1844 and 1848. It was supposed to care for 200 patients, but soon it became overcrowded. At its peak, it held up to 1,500 people. Imagine the chaos and suffering in such a crowded place. The asylum was designed like a village, with its own farms and workshops. But behind the pleasant facade, terrible things happened. Patients faced harsh treatments like prefrontal lobotomies. This brutal procedure involved cutting into the brain and often left patients worse off. Between 1942 and 1944, over 20 patients underwent lobotomies at Denbigh. Tragically, one patient died during the operation. Even worse, violent patients were sometimes kept in cages, treated more like animals than human beings. By the 1960s, the asylum's dark reputation caught up with it. Enoch Powell, a British member of Parliament, called for its closure. But it took until 1995 for the doors to finally close for good. Today, Denbigh Asylum stands abandoned, a shadow of its former self. The buildings are falling apart, covered in ivy and graffiti. But the eerie atmosphere remains. People say that the asylum is haunted by the ghosts of its past. Visitors report hearing strange noises and seeing ghostly figures. One of the most chilling tales is about a figure seen wandering the halls at night. This ghost is believed to be a former patient, still trapped in the place that caused so much suffering. Walking through Denby Asylum today, you can almost hear the echoes of the past. The air feels heavy with sadness and fear. The place is a stark reminder of the horrors that happen behind its walls. Denby Asylum's story is a warning about the dangers of neglect and mistreatment. It shows us what happens when a place meant for care becomes a site of cruelty. And before moving forward, guys, most of you just watch the video and leave it. Please hit the subscribe button if you're really enjoying it. It takes a lot of effort to create these types of videos, or maybe you will face something like these. Next, we visit the Hagedorn Psychiatric Hospital in New Jersey, a place with a dark and troubling past. Hagedorn Hospital was built in 1907. It was originally meant to treat tuberculosis, a deadly lung disease. The hospital was supposed to help patients get better and go home. But things didn't go as planned. Over the years, Hagedorn started taking in patients with mental illnesses. By 1929, about 10,000 people had been treated there. The hospital was meant to be a place of healing, but it became a place of pain and fear. Patients faced harsh treatments. Some were locked in their rooms for days. Others were subjected to electroshock therapy. This painful procedure involved shocking the brain with electricity. It was supposed to help, but it often caused more harm than good. As time went on, the hospital fell into disrepair. By the 1970s, it was clear that Hagedorn could no longer provide proper care. A new psychiatric facility was built nearby for elderly patients. But Hagedorn continued to decline. In 2012, Hagedorn Psychiatric Hospital was officially closed. The buildings were left abandoned, and the once busy halls became silent. Today, the hospital stands as a ghostly reminder of its dark past. People say that Hagedorn is haunted. Visitors report hearing strange sounds and feeling cold spots. Some claim to see shadowy figures moving through the empty rooms. The most chilling story is about a former patient who still roams the halls. People have seen this ghostly figure in old hospital clothes, wandering aimlessly. Walking through Hagedorn today, you can feel the weight of its history. The silence is eerie, and the air feels heavy with the stories of those who suffered there. The decaying walls seem to hold the whispers of the past. Hagedorn Psychiatric Hospital is a stark reminder of how places meant for healing can turn into sites of horror. The dark history of this hospital warns us about the dangers of neglect and mistreatment. Next, we travel to Italy, to the island of San Servolo, where the Ricoveri di San Servolo holds a dark and eerie history. Ricoveri di San Servolo was established in 1888. It was meant to be a safe place for people with mental illnesses. Dr. Luigi Scabbia, who ran the asylum, wanted it to be like a small village. There were shops, gardens, and even a court for legal matters. But things quickly took a dark turn. The asylum became overcrowded. By 1960, over 6,000 patients were crammed into the buildings. The conditions were terrible. Patients were treated like prisoners. They faced brutal treatments like electroshock therapy, where electricity was used to shock their brains. Some patients were given insulin-induced comas. This involved injecting large amounts of insulin to cause a coma, which was supposed to help with their mental illness. Instead, it often caused great pain and suffering. One of the most chilling practices involved ice baths. Patients were submerged in ice-cold water as a form of punishment or so-called treatment. The shock of the cold was supposed to calm them, but it often led to more fear and distress. The asylum's dark history continued until 1978. That year, the Basaglia law was passed, which aimed to close down these inhumane institutions. Ricoveri di San Servolo finally shut its doors, ending the suffering within its walls. Today, the island of San Servolo is quiet, but the abandoned buildings still stand. The walls are covered in graffiti and the gardens are overgrown. But the most haunting reminder of its past is the artwork left by a patient named Fernando Nanetti. He covered the walls with intricate drawings that tell the story of his pain and the abuses he witnessed. Visitors to San Servolo report feeling uneasy. They hear whispers and see shadows moving in the empty halls. Some say they feel a cold presence, as if the ghosts of the past are still there. Walking through the abandoned asylum, you can almost hear the echoes of the patients' cries. The place feels heavy with sorrow and fear. The Recovery di San Servolo stands as a grim reminder of the cruelty that once took place there. The story of Recovery di San Servolo warns us of the horrors that can happen when people are treated without compassion. It shows us the dark side of mental health care in the past and reminds us of the need for kindness and understanding. Our next stop is the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia, a place with a dark and chilling past. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum opened its doors in 1863. It was designed by Thomas Kirkbride, a mental health expert who believed that patients needed space and light to heal. The asylum had large rooms, long halls, and beautiful grounds. But things quickly went wrong. The asylum was meant to hold 250 patients, but by the 1950s, it housed over 2,400. The overcrowding led to terrible conditions. Patients were crammed into small spaces, with little care or attention. One of the most terrifying parts of the asylum's history involves Dr. Walter Freeman. He was famous for performing ice pick lobotomies. This brutal procedure involved inserting an ice pick into the brain through the eye socket. Dr. Freeman performed about 4,000 lobotomies at the asylum, leaving many patients severely disabled or worse. The asylum also used other harsh treatments. Patients were given electroshock therapy and hydrotherapy, where they were placed in cold or hot water for long periods. These treatments were supposed to help, but they often caused more harm. In 1949, an exposé revealed the awful conditions at the asylum. The story showed how patients were neglected and mistreated. This led to changes, but it took many more years before the asylum finally closed in 1994. Today, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum stands abandoned, but it is far from empty. People say it is one of the most haunted places in America. Visitors report hearing strange noises, seeing ghostly figures, and feeling cold spots. Some even claim to have been touched by unseen hands. One of the most famous ghost stories is about a little girl named Lily. She is said to have died at the asylum and now haunts one of the rooms. Visitors leave toys for her, and some say they hear her laughing or see her playing. Walking through the abandoned halls of the asylum, you can feel the weight of its dark history. The silence is eerie, filled with the echoes of the past. The place feels heavy with sadness and fear, as if the walls themselves remember the suffering that took place there. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum is a stark reminder of the dark side of mental health care. It shows us the horrors that can happen when people are treated without compassion. The stories from this asylum warn us about the dangers of neglect and mistreatment. Our next destination is Beechworth Lunatic Asylum in Australia, a place known for its dark and disturbing history. Beechworth Lunatic Asylum opened in 1867 in Victoria, Australia. It was built to house and treat people with mental illnesses. The asylum was a large, imposing structure designed to keep the patients inside and the outside world out. At its peak, Beechworth housed over 1,200 patients. The conditions were often terrible. The asylum was overcrowded, and the treatments were harsh. Patients were subjected to electroshock therapy, where electric currents were passed through their brains. This treatment was supposed to help, but it often caused pain and fear. Straitjackets were also commonly used. Patients were restrained for hours, sometimes even days. This made them feel trapped and helpless. The asylum's methods were more about control than care. One of the most chilling practices at Beechworth was the use of shackles. Violent or uncontrollable patients were chained to their beds or walls. This was meant to keep them from harming themselves or others, but it often led to more suffering. The asylum also had a dark history of patient deaths. Over 3,000 patients died at Beechworth during its years of operation. Some died from the harsh treatments, while others succumbed to the neglect and poor conditions. Beechworth Lunatic Asylum finally closed its doors in 1995. But the building was not empty for long. People say that the spirits of former patients still haunt the halls. Visitors report hearing strange noises, seeing ghostly figures, and feeling cold spots. One of the most famous ghost stories is about a woman named Matron Sharp. She was a nurse at the asylum and is said to still watch over the patients. People claim to see her ghostly figure in the halls, and some even feel her touch. Another chilling tale is about a little boy named James. He is said to have died at the asylum and now haunts the building. Visitors leave toys for him, and some say they hear him laughing or see him playing. Walking through the abandoned halls of Beechworth Lunatic Asylum, you can feel the weight of its dark past. The silence is eerie, filled with the echoes of the suffering that once took place there. The air feels heavy with sadness and fear, as if the walls themselves remember the pain. Beechworth Lunatic Asylum is a stark reminder of the dark side of mental health care. It shows us the horrors that can happen when people are treated without compassion. The stories from this asylum warn us about the dangers of neglect and mistreatment. Our next stop is Penrose State School in Pennsylvania, a place with a dark and horrifying history. Penrose State School opened in 1908. It was built to care for people with mental and physical disabilities. The campus was large, with many buildings spread out over a wide area. It was supposed to be a place of care and safety, but it quickly became a place of fear and suffering. At its peak, Penrose housed thousands of patients. The conditions were terrible. The staff was often untrained and unkind. Patients were neglected and mistreated. Many were kept in small, cramped rooms. Some were even tied to their beds or locked in cages. One of the most disturbing parts of Penrose history is the abuse that took place. Patients were often beaten and punished for small things. There were also reports of sexual abuse. The staff who were supposed to care for the patients often caused them the most harm. In 1968, a television expose revealed the awful conditions at Penrose. The story showed patients living in filth, with little food or medical care. This caused a public outcry, but it took many years for things to change. By the 1980s, Penrose was finally closed. The patients were moved to better facilities, but the damage had been done. The buildings were left abandoned, filled with the echoes of the past. People say that Penrose is haunted. Visitors report hearing screams and cries, feeling cold spots, and seeing ghostly figures. One of the most chilling tales is about a little girl named Emily. She is said to have died at Penrose and now haunts the halls. People claim to see her ghostly figure and hear her crying. Another scary story is about the tunnels beneath Penrose. These tunnels were used to move patients from building to building. Today, people report hearing footsteps and whispers in the dark. Some even say they feel hands grabbing at them as they walk through. Walking through Penrose State School today, you can feel the weight of its dark history. The silence is eerie, filled with the echoes of the suffering that once took place there. The air feels heavy with sadness and fear, as if the walls themselves remember the pain. Penrose State School is a stark reminder of the dark side of care. It shows us the horrors that can happen when people are treated without compassion. The stories from this place warn us about the dangers of neglect and mistreatment. Our final stop is Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts, a place with a history that is both dark and chilling. Danvers State Hospital opened in 1878. It was built to help people with mental illnesses. The hospital was designed in a Gothic style, with tall spires and long, twisting hallways. It was meant to look grand and welcoming, but inside, it was a different story. At its peak, Danvers housed over 2,000 patients. The hospital quickly became overcrowded, and the conditions were terrible. Patients were often kept in small, dark rooms. They were given little food and almost no medical care. One of the most terrifying parts of Danvers history involves lobotomies. This brutal procedure involved cutting into the brain to try to control mental illness. Many patients were left permanently damaged by this treatment. Dr. Walter Freeman, who was famous for his lobotomies, performed many of these operations at Danvers. The hospital also used electroshock therapy and hydrotherapy. Patients were strapped to tables and shocked with electricity or placed in ice-cold water for hours. These treatments were meant to help, but they often caused more pain and fear. By the 1940s, the conditions at Danvers were so bad that people started to notice. Reports and investigations revealed the awful treatment of patients. This led to changes, but it took many years for the hospital to finally close. In 1992, Danvers State Hospital shut its doors for good. The buildings were left to decay, and the once grand hospital became a ghostly ruin. But even though the hospital is closed, people say it is still full of spirits. Visitors report hearing screams and seeing shadowy figures in the abandoned halls. One of the most famous ghost stories is about a nurse who still walks the halls, even though the hospital has been closed for decades. People see her ghostly figure, dressed in an old-fashioned nurse's uniform, moving silently through the building. Another chilling tale is about the tunnels beneath the hospital. These tunnels were used to move patients and supplies. Today, people report hearing footsteps and whispers in the dark. Some say they feel a cold presence following them as they walk through. Walking through Danvers State Hospital today, you can feel the weight of its dark history. The silence is eerie, filled with the echoes of the suffering that once took place there. The air feels heavy with sadness and fear, as if the walls themselves remember the pain. Danvers State Hospital is a stark reminder of the dark side of mental health care. It shows us the horrors that can happen when people are treated without compassion. The stories from this hospital warn us about the dangers of neglect and mistreatment. We've explored the dark histories of the world's most infamous abandoned asylums. These places, once meant to heal, became sites of unimaginable suffering. As we walked through these haunted halls, we felt the echoes of the past. These stories warn us to treat the vulnerable with kindness and empathy. Thank you for joining us on this chilling journey. If you found this as haunting as we did, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Share your thoughts and other haunted places in the comments. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.